As entrepreneurs, we all want our companies to be super successful. But what happens when that's not the case? What happens when we have to face the realities of a company just not working out? Today, we talk with Cristina Poindexter about her profound learning journey with Parable, a brain health venture that faced significant challenges and ultimately didn't succeed as a business. As you'll learn, that sucked and it wasn't easy for Cristina to get through. But that doesn't mean that starting the company was a mistake or that Cristina isn't excited about what lies ahead. This is probably the most thorough breakdown of a company that we've done so far on this podcast, and I'm really excited about it. Cristina and I talk in detail about the pros and cons of the venture studio model, co-CEO dynamics and what that meant for the business, what it's really like to run a company in the CPG space where you have a lot of physical product to move and a lot of cost as a result, how to approach the fundraising process, and of course, what to do when things don't work out as planned. I'm incredibly grateful to Cristina for opening up about the highs and lows of her entrepreneurial journey and sharing this experience with us. No matter what kind of company you're running, there's a lot to learn from her insights and practical advice. So let's jump into another episode of the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast. Hey, Cristina, so great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely, Alex. Happy to be here.
Now, you have such an interesting story because you have a tremendous amount of entrepreneurial experience, having built companies, having been a EIR or a founder in residence also, but like really worked at early stage with a number of different companies. You've also worked at a number of really well-known brands, places like Google, places like Headspace. Like, so have a really interesting perspective on business, what's going on in the 21st century. And that created, I think, a lot of opportunity and interesting projects for you. And the thing that I thought we would talk about today, which specifically is going to be of tremendous interest to our listeners here at the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast, is this one company that you're working on recently called Parable. And you have been so open about that company, what worked, what didn't work, things we might have done differently, and the very great number of challenges that face an entrepreneur while he or she is building a business. And I would love to, with your permission, dive into that company a little bit, understand what was going on there and what we can pull out of that and extract so that the whole audience can learn from that. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's get into it.
Awesome. Fantastic. So you were co-founder and co-CEO of this business, Parable. It was in the brain health space. So this was a physical product for nutrition, for brain nutrition. And I remember it. I remember the brand Parable when it was out in like 2022, 2023, something like that. I remember the fact that there was a brand for this. I remember looking at it. It was really cool. Tell us about kind of how we decided that this was a business that we wanted to pursue.
Sure. So the story of Parable really started in 2020. And it was when my, Parable co-founder and I met at a venture studio that was put on in collaboration between M13 Ventures out here in LA and PepsiCo. And the whole focus of that time was to spin up companies in the health and wellness space that really had some kind of nutrition, basis. And, I've prior to Parable, my entire career has been in the tech space. And yet as, someone who personally has been very deeply immersed in, her own wellness journey, I have always kind of craved getting outside of the tech ecosystem and just the kinds of products and services you can deliver via technology into things that really are physical in nature. And so I joined that venture studio because it sounded super interesting and enabling me to get into, physical products and nutrition and things of that kind. And obviously with, some good, wind in our sails. So that was the origin of Parable really came out of that venture studio. And then kind of Brian and I shaped it and took it to the races.
And what was the spark that said, hey, the thing that we should be doing is brain nutrition?
Well, there were a lot of different things that came together, candidly. So, I'm not sure how many of your listeners are familiar with the venture studio model, but in this case, PepsiCo came to the table with, candidly, a lot of market research and consumer research reports about where the market's heading and what people need. And there was an entire section devoted to cognitive health and some of the innovations around nutraceuticals for cognitive health in some of what they had provided. And that was also coming, in intersection with myself in the past. I have worked at Headspace in the mental health and mindfulness space. I myself have been very open about my own mental health journey. And I've also had 4 concussions, which is something that I hadn't really disclosed to a lot of people. And my own path in healing from those concussions involved nutrition-based approaches. And so coming into that venture studio was really the first time where I was like reading the literature around just how powerful nutrition is for the brain, and seeing all of these trends around the baby boomer population aging, and that basically creating this huge need for cognitive health interventions to really try to get in front of things like Alzheimer's and dementia. But the interesting thing about Parable and what we were doing with it is the brand itself was really focused on this concept of brain care. And we were likening it to skincare, right? Like skincare is something that we have all, become accustomed to as this thing that we just do to take care of an element of ourselves throughout our lifespan. And really our nervous systems as a whole, our brains as a whole, right? Not just the brain itself, but all the nerves that run through the entire body need care on a daily basis for your entire life, right? And that's a little hard to know how to do that. And so being able to start with a supplement was really our path in to form a really accessible brand, introducing people to the power of nutrition on their nervous systems.
Very cool. Very cool. And so just to make sure that everyone listening does understand, give us a, very quick overview. What is a venture studio and how does that model work for founders?
Yeah. So a venture studio, it typically involves 2 or 3 sets of partners, I would say. One is typically an investor set. The other is entrepreneurs or founders in residence, or folks who have entrepreneurial experience and leadership ability to kind of pull together ideas into companies. And they come together and they look at the market as a whole, look at a variety of different opportunities, that are in the space, and ultimately start tinkering around, building companies from scratch, testing them, validating them, seeing where there's heat. And eventually, if one picks off, there's various different models, but the entrepreneur in residence will often take that and run with it. So leave the kind of the incubator, if you will, of the venture studio, but the venture capital firm or the investors that did help fund that are they have a stake in the cap table, so they're along for the ride as well.
So the pros and cons of this are it's somewhat de-risked because we have a lot of people working on a number of ideas and sort of stress testing things and at least understanding what the potential opportunity is. And then the downside is there may already be a lot of people on the cap table or a lot of people with involvement. And does that mean a smaller equity stake for the founders then?
Yeah, so that's certainly a choice in going into a venture studio model is as a founder, right? Like, we as founders and residents, like we're actually hired as contractors for a 3-month period by M13. And that at the time I had been, kind of tinkering around with my own ideas. I had left Headspace about 6 months prior. I knew I wanted to start a new company, but I had been consulting, right? And that's the way I was, paying my bills and also like tinkering around on what I could do to come. And so for me as an entrepreneur, I was like, well, I don't know what's going to come out of this opportunity, but it's a really interesting way to contract, with an investment firm. And if an idea comes out of it, awesome. We'll talk about it then. And so it did for me make kind of the path into entrepreneurship financially de-risked. Although I knew at the time that I was also giving myself a pretty serious ceiling if the venture did kind of flourish. So that's a choice I made also because for me, it was very important to start the company with a community around me. It was COVID, right? We're all working virtually. I had actually just moved to Colorado at the time. And so the premise of coming in with a group of really high caliber founders and residents with, PepsiCo as well and M13 and all their consumer investment experience within the LA ecosystem was honestly a fantastic experience.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. It makes a ton of sense. And I know that a lot of interesting companies come out of that model. Like myself, I went through Techstars, which is different. They do some of those things in partnership with large corporates. I went through Techstars Boulder back a while ago, so different type of idea. But I mean, I'm all for community support. I'm all for having as many hands on deck, as much wind in your sails as possible. So that's why I really like that model. So you meet your co-founder and you decide, okay, this is a thing based on the research that we have from Pepsi, and we're stress testing, and we decide, okay, let's go. Then what happened with the business? What was the building like?
Yeah, so I mean, the 3 month program itself was. I had a friend that joked that we should have turned it into like a reality TV show, because there were like a lot of different, there's a bunch of folks, and candidly, we're all in a way competing for funding, right? Coming out of that 3 month program, and I think that was actually a really wonderful environment, because it was both collaborative and we pushed our ideas to be great, right? And we actually started, I think, with over 700 different venture ideas between about 13 founders and residents, and whittled that down to, I think it was 6 or 7 that came out of the program.
So cool.
Yeah, and so coming out of the program, we had basically a pre-seed round already secured. Drove that into a seed round, and that gave us a really solid foundation to start from.
And CPG is tough, so seed round will only take you so far. What were your models showing about what you needed to raise versus what you needed to produce? And presumably there's some science that was going into the formulation of Parable. Like this is not as simple as just like a mobile app or something, very, very, there's low capital requirements.
Yes. There was a founder who termed a phrase that I thought was hilarious, which he called CPG products ephemeral hardware, right? It's like hardware that expires. So it's a very capital intensive industry. And this is something that I wrote kind of a long Substack, and I think you've read it, but for those who are curious, I wrote a long Substack on what I thought, we should have done differently, and my learnings as a result of my time there. And one of them was, I think we should have raised twice the amount. And it is because we were doing a clinical trial on the formulation itself, which is not something that's standard for a consumer supplement. That was something that for me was super important, because I knew, like, if we're putting things in people's bodies that quite literally get absorbed by their brains and nervous systems, I want to know this is legit, because I'm not willing to spend my time as a snake oil salesman. I just won't do it.
No, you want to get that validation, and you want to have science behind you, right? And that's so important to get the credibility you're going to need to sell.
Yeah. But in a way, because we were pursuing that clinical trial route, in a sense, we were bridging pharma, healthcare, wellness, and like a tech startup world. And yet we raised the kind of round that was really for like a seed round app, right? That didn't have the clinical, requirements and the funding that goes into that. And also for a CPG product, you have to think about retail and wholesale and selling up front and producing in batches, and those batches do expire. And, so the cash flow is different. I'll just put it that way. It's different.
It is. And what, I'm a total outsider when it comes to CPG, but I'll say, just from seeing some of my friends who operate in this world, the trick, especially in the 21st century CPG, seems to be, I got to get subscriptions. I got to get people coming back. I'm not just selling this once. It has to be a continuous thing. And in a world of fairly high cost of acquisition advertising model, it's really hard to do that in a consistent way without sort of a subscription or, something that's going to add more consistency to the flow. Now, were you doing both physical, like were you stocking stores and online, or was this online only?
We started just online, although we were certainly in conversations with retailers, because we knew that we were going to take an omni-channel approach. I do think that starting online is smart, in the sense that you don't need to, it takes quite a while to establish these partnerships, with retailers, the Targets and the Whole Foods of the world, right? And starting online gives you more flexibility. However, the CAC is very high. And so that's something that we ran into as certainly a big challenge. And the advice I give entrepreneurs now that are entering this space is, really start with a community-based approach that decreases your reliance on ads and more the direct response kind of logical way to go to market. Like, do illogical things that don't scale at the beginning, establish that community, test your way into product market fit, and then, go do the ads and the wholesale model that does have higher capital requirements.
So what does that actually mean, do a community model? How does that manifest? What does that look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, that looks like, working with, established, and established means they just exist already, right? Brands, partners that already have their own communities and, work together to basically introduce your brand and product vis-a-vis their communities, right? And often these are non-competitive players that care about the same things, right? So a good example for, Parable, I'm making this up right now, but could have been a journaling app company, right? So someone that's, a brand that's focused on mental health, but selling physical products that are completely non-competitive with a supplement that goes in your morning smoothie. But you can imagine in the morning, you're journaling and you're drinking a smoothie, and like both of those go hand in hand, right? And so I think we are also in a, I say we, but I'm making the assumption a lot of the entrepreneurs listening to this, if they're listening to a conscious entrepreneur podcast, many of you are mission driven folks, and there's many people out there that will resonate with your mission, right? Brands and, colleagues in the business space. And that is actually something that's really powerful at the beginning for startups, right? Is go to talk to the folks that have a similar mission, right? That aren't competing with you, and work together to like help each other get your products out. I think that's kind of an underutilized tactic, and one that's increasingly powerful.
And a great way to lower your cost of acquiring customers, especially if it's coming through a trusted brand or an existing community. I can definitely see the power of that. Yeah. And so you launched online. Uh, what were you learning about the business once you launched? What was working? What was giving you excitement? What were the things that were not working and keeping you up at night?
Yeah, it's a long list. It's a long list, Alex. Well, I think the mission and, everything that we were sharing around the vision of where brain care could go and can still go. I actually still believe that a player is going to dominate the space, and I'm rooting for whoever that is. Um, I think that was very exciting, and candidly also to the venture ecosystem. There was a lot of heat there. As a brand entering a space that's regulated by various different regulatory agencies in terms of what you can say, like the words you can actually use to talk about what this thing does. I think rightly so. You don't want people going out and saying, "Oh, this cures cancer and this will prevent Alzheimer's." And it's like, you can't actually prove that. But that doesn't mean that you can't, make some very serious claims about what the product can do. The tricky part for us is we had, the clinical trial that we did on the product showed that it was materially effective for over a dozen different measures of cognitive health, mental health, and neural health. And that comes with a lot of words and terms, everything from brain fog, to anxiety, to clarity, to productivity. A lot of these buzzwords that ultimately, like, we needed a lot of revs to figure out like what was sticky from a messaging perspective. And candidly, like that was hard. That we kind of ran out of time and ran out of funding on that, given
Right.
that we were in the ads-based model, because we had so many things to figure out, like how do we actually talk about this with consumers. And we couldn't necessarily go back and change cogs, right? And it's a high cogs product because it was so, it was very high quality. And yeah, that was really tricky. Fundraising as well. I mean, it's a classic. Everyone knows fundraising is hard. But fundraising, for a CPG business through a venture-backed model, the math, honestly, I don't think works very well. I just don't think venture capital is really the way to fund CPG. And I know people would disagree with me, and there's great venture funds that do it, and folks that figure it out. I just don't think it was necessarily right for Parable.
Mm.
Um, Certainly not in the way that we did it. We needed more money up front if we're going to do it that way.
Well, you also mentioned, so by the way, I just want to say this Substack post, which we'll share when we put out the episode, we'll share the link to it. But this thing is, it's called The Power of Parable, and it's such a tremendous deep dive into everything that happened over the journey. And one of the things that you point out on that is, not only is it hard to have CPG venture dynamics work properly, but if you're focusing on double bottom line or like impact, then it
Yeah.
gets even more complicated, doesn't it?
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's financially, impact is not always impactful, right? And it's financially, it would have been better if our supplement, instead of having, the near 10 ingredients that it had 3, right? And instead of being focused on a dozen markers of cognitive, mental, and neural health, it maybe just focused on one aspect of cognitive health, right? And that's actually something where we were going after holistic brain care, because to us, it wasn't just about Alzheimer's. It wasn't just about productivity. It wasn't just about anxiety. It's like the nervous system needs to be cared for, period, right? One needs to be in the product to care for the nervous system in that way. And it's just a broader range of ingredients than the market was used to. And that means it's a higher cost product, right? But it is very tricky to stand for quality, especially in the health and wellness space, when financially it's more expensive, right? That
Well,
is
the other lesson that I'm getting from that is this thing that we always hear with startups is startups see an idea and they think, oh, I'm going to go do everything. And I've got a huge market and I've got an opportunity in all these different areas. And for founders, it can be really nerve wracking to like narrow it down, to focus and to keep going into a smaller niche and then a smaller niche and then a smaller niche, like you're saying. So if all of a sudden we've got this product that might have an impact in 12 different areas of brain health, then we've got 12 messages, like, so many permutations around ads and messaging and how we're talking about this, as opposed to, hey, this helps with brain fog, or this helps with, helps you wake up and feel more clarity. Like the thing that's coming to my mind when you're saying all this is in the store, they have these like anti-hangover pills right at the checkout counter. And that's just like, bang, I get it. Now, I don't really consume a lot of alcohol, so it doesn't talk to me as a person, but as soon as I see the little packet, I'm like, okay, I understand who that's for. You're saying that you were having this challenge of trying to be holistic, where maybe being focused would have been more helpful, or at least allowed you to accelerate. Am I getting that right?
absolutely, yeah. It can be scary to pick a niche, right? Especially when you know that the product helps with many, many different things. You don't want to necessarily limit your upside and your market. But like to anyone listening who's like considering this, it's like, pick a niche. It's actually really powerful, because then if you do well in that niche, great, check, moving on, expand, right?
It's
And
such a counterintuitive thing and founders just lose so many cycles and lose so much sleep over this. I've done it myself also. Like, oh, we can do this for so many people. Let's have a really broad value proposition. But guess what? When people land on your website and you have a broad value proposition, they can't tell that you're talking about them. And so the exercise here is just to keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And hopefully over time, you do the bowling pin analogy from Crossing the Chasm, the Jeffrey Moore book, right? Around you hit one with a rifle, and then that knocks down the other one, as opposed to doing everything with a shotgun, which is the scatter shot approach. So we could have niched down a little bit. I understand that. Tell me about the fundraising part of this. Like, what were those conversations like? And I know you have a specific set of experiences around fundraising.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely experienced headwinds in fundraising. My co-CEO, co-founder Brian Davis and I split fundraising duties, and there was something that was powerful about that, and something that was tricky about that, of having a co-CEO model, which we can certainly speak to. And for me, there's this mindset of going out and creating a CRM of investors. And we spoke to over 200 investors, right? Pitched over 200 investors. And like
that alone is just such a slog, right? I mean, that's a huge number. That's a huge time suck.
Yeah. And it's not just the pitches, right? It's the follow-ups, it's the data rooms, and it's the ghosting, it's the not clear answer of like, is this a no? Should I keep talking to you or not? Right. Like, and I learned a lot from that, because I'll say one of the things I learned the most is how I was still self-modifying myself to try to sell, right? To try to make this thing appear really wonderful, because I believed in it. And that's not a bad thing, but it's very taxing, day in, day out, when you're doing 200 pitches, to, always present it in a certain way. And I think that for myself was also a learning of a co-CEO model, which I actually do think has really good aspects of it. It's just like a big pro-con puzzle, where in order to stay in lockstep, Brian and I very much had scripts, and we had we would align on how we would present it and how we wouldn't. And I found that while that helped us stay in alignment as leaders, what it didn't allow me was in the moment in a conversation to go off script and get really genuine and go and follow my intuition of what that conversation really needed. Right. And that was this huge learning for me that, ultimately I decided like, I actually owe it to myself to not be in the kind of leadership situation where I'm unable to follow my intuition in that way, because I could tell that that's actually what the company needed from me to actually close the race, right? It needed me to go off script. It needed me to be intuitive and go about it in a way that I could just kind of sense my way into the field. And no one around me was really telling me like, oh, that's okay. That's right. Everyone was like, oh
Mm,
no, like pitch more people, like go through the CRM, follow up 7 times, like
got
share
it.
more data rooms, like get more intros. And the reality for me was there was this period where, I wrote this LinkedIn post that went viral. I wrote it, like, honestly, I was just really tired one morning. And I just wrote about my experience somatically fundraising, right? I talked about the in between of like, you get off a call and you just like have to go shake off the energy or like lay down on the floor to calm yourself down, or, the silly things I would do to get my energy up the next day. It was like, I do my hair different or, and it really, it resonated with so many, I'd say not just women. I got hundreds of DMs from that post on LinkedIn, of all of the founders and entrepreneurs and even investors in the community, basically coming to me and saying like, yeah, we're exhausted, or we're physically exhausted too from this process, right?
Man, that
So
is such a the post you're referring to is the title is fundraising while female. Is that correct?
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean that's how I refer to it because I
That's what
tag.
we yeah, that's what we call it. And that was a big deal post. I remember when that came out. I did not know you then, but I remember when that kind of the discussion that it all sparked around this, rightly so. And I just want to I want to talk about that and the reaction there, but I just want to jump into something I heard you say because I think it's important. You said one of the challenges when you were doing all these pitches was you were self-modifying. And does this mean that you're not allowing yourself to fully show up in the way that you want? Are you sticking too tightly to the script? Are you not allowing the full force and passion and set of talents to come forward? Like what was that dynamic all about?
Yeah. So I think part of it for me is a stylistic thing, and I'll get to that in a second. And the other is, I think, this pressure that we all feel, and to a certain extent, candidly, is important around presenting what's working, right? I am not, I don't consider myself a salesperson, which I've had thoughts around like, okay, maybe founders just need to be salespeople. But the way that I really, establish trust with people is I'm just an honest person. Like I wanted to go into what didn't work. I wanted my investors to problem solve with me, right? I didn't want to sell them and have them like come along because they thought this was like the perfect, most amazing thing. Like I wanted people who understood what wasn't working to get in the trenches with us so that they could actually help us fix it and like make this thing successful and like partner, right? And instead, a lot of the what felt like just like the culture or just like the salt in the water, right, that I couldn't get out was the sense that like I needed to perform and to impress the investors, and that there's this power dynamic, the investors kind of leaning back and like, do I like you or not? And like, oh, I'm in the position of power because I have the capital, right? And you feel that dynamic, right? You feel day in, day out when you're having all these conversations with people who are leaning back in a position of power. And it really can get to you. And I think that there's, again, going to that word self-modify, there's things that I would just have to do to kind of buttress myself in those situations to try to not take on that energy of like, I am less than this person because this person across from me has the money and I'm doing the dance, right? They have the money, I'm doing the dance. And that's not how it is. And it's not how it should be, right? And I learned over time, like if I was really feeling that dynamic, that investor was absolutely not a good partner for me, right? For me, for us, for the company, just based off culturally my values. And yet it's still difficult to, I think also the investor side, they do have to just go out and meet a ton of people and like listen to a lot of people, and a lot of the things won't be aligned. And I like really empathize with that too. But there's just something about the process of venture capital investors meeting entrepreneurs in conversations about money and fundraising that culturally feels very toxic and very off. And like where I've left is, I know myself, I've, co-founded 2 companies. I'm probably going to start another one, right? Like, and so I have a lot of thoughts where I'm like, okay, well, how do I do this again? I don't think venture capitalists are evil, right? I don't think capitalism is evil. I think it can grease the wheels of change in society very efficiently. And I love efficiency. And so I would create a business the next time around that is actually a business before it needs substantial funding. And that is something that I think we've kind of lost in the venture capital world. It's the best Wizards of Oz win, right? Those who can create the best illusions and circle up the best magic around them before anything even exists win. And yet let's not lose sight of the fact that that is a very different skill set than a business, right? A business transacts, there's cash flow, you want to actually make money, right? Like, and if you do that well, if the business itself, the craft of creating that engine is done well, it creates its own money. That's the whole point. So you don't need to go out and lean on people who have money. And so that to me is really the challenge this time around is, call it bootstrapping or whatever, but how do you create a business that is such a solid engine at the beginning that like it's a solid engine before you bring in growth capital, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but like make it a solid engine first.
Totally makes sense. And that's the recipe for a durable business. Tell me, what did you learn from the reaction to this viral LinkedIn post? Like, what came out? What surprised you from there?
Yeah. Well, as a woman, I learned how many women are not telling their stories publicly. I felt like I was the priest in the confession booth. I felt like I had like out of nowhere become this safe space for women to share with me the reality of their lived experience, right? And men, and those DMs still just live in my private inbox and they're not going anywhere, right?
So you're just collecting tons of stories from women who are like, yeah, same, or sharing what happened to them and their frustrations and their experiences.
Yeah, and it's everything ranging from exhaustion, frustrations, experiences to things of a more nefarious kind, right? But I think my biggest learning was that there's a somatic, I'll use that word again, like a physical thing that happens to our bodies when we are founders in the trenches, and that actually is something that is part of the journey. And it's actually led to what I'm really interested in now, which is a lot of work around movement and expressive arts, like physically, because there's only so much that any mentor of mine, any advisor of mine could help me with from a strategic point of view, right? Like I had some of the best advisors around me, amazing investors in my circle, people who have been there, done it, raised millions, built huge businesses. And what none of them could really teach me how to do was like shake off the energy of toxicity after a call. No one could teach me that. And that's actually something I don't think that we're talking about yet in the mental health world, is like we're still up in our heads. We're up in strategy. We're up in intellectualizing. Meditation is great. It starts to get into the physical body, but we as mental health entrepreneurs need to get into the physical body. There's no way around that. Right. And so that to me is what that post really left me with, is like, whoa, I've tapped into something here that no one really knows how to solve yet. And that's actually given me a lot of fire the last year to like figure it out personally. And I'm still in that exploration first, like a lot through dance and, movement arts of various forms. But I think there's something to bring back out to the entrepreneur community, which is coaching of a different kind that has to do with body-based therapy, right? And that to me is a really exciting nascent space that honestly like started from that post.
Wow. Really cool to see that. And I totally agree around our nervous systems as entrepreneurs get so stressed and so whacked, and we don't have good ways of dealing with this stuff yet. And you can read the books, watch the videos, do the this or that, or the meditating or psychedelics or whatever it is, and it's still coming at you all the time. It comes at you every single day as an entrepreneur. Let's shift back into Parable here. It was interesting to hear you talk about being co-CEO. This is not something we come across a lot. In fact, I recently had someone on this podcast, Eric Severinghaus, who is in a co-CEO role and really likes it. That's after having been CEO of several different companies himself and kind of purposely choosing this path. Why did you decide that this was the right thing to do? And what did you learn about the pros and cons of a co-CEO role?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll start with kind of how we decided to even have that arrangement. Because I do think the path into it is important. So I had, Parable was the second startup that I co-founded, venture-backed model. My prior startup, which was called Maslow, I came in kind of after my co-founder kind of pitched me entirely. He had already kind of started it, and I was very much coming in second, and definitely shaped the vision, but I wasn't the real initiator of it, and I was also kind of inexperienced. That was the first venture-backed startup I did, and I didn't really know what I was getting into yet. And I took a COO role, and in that experience, I learned that was not the right role for me, right? And so I was coming into Parable and coming into the venture studio with M13 already with a sense of what I could and could not accept necessarily in terms of like my own leadership abilities and what I really desired to do candidly as a leader. And that was a really, I'll say, vulnerable thing to own as a woman, is coming in and being like, you know what, I would like to be the CEO of the company that I start. And that was something that as Brian and I started working together more and more on the specific idea that became Parable, right? We all came in as equal founders and residents, right? And it was very clear to me as well at a certain point when, I was like, okay, Brian, I think we need to have this conversation. I'm not interested in being COO in this arrangement, right? I've done it before. I just know it doesn't bring out my skill set. It's not something that I'm able to commit to. And there was a really interesting conversation that we had at the time. He was like, no, but before you break up with me, have you considered a co-CEO arrangement? And candidly, I was like, no, I hadn't considered that. And so, one of the things that, Brian, I'll say Brian and I still have a great relationship, and I have so much respect for him. And I feel like over the course of our, 2+ year working relationship, I think we both helped each other grow in such beautiful and amazing ways that have shaped me, definitely. Right. And so I want to preface with that, because I think that there's a lot of curiosity, like, oh, did they just not get along? I'll get to kind of the full story. But in coming into that, there was also something that united Brian and I around co-CEO, which is, hey, could we actually, and it was a challenge for us, but it was a mission-based challenge of, could we actually change the culture here, that there's only one way of leading companies, which is this like, king at the top, and then, all the disciples around them, and this kind of like pyramid structure. Like, could we actually role model a different way? And that was a really exciting prompt for me to be in the investigation of. And it's why kind of throughout the Parable journey as well, and even now, like, I've done my best to be as open as I can about the pros and cons of the co-CEO model. So make a long story short, decided to do the co-CEO model. We had at the beginning, we kind of sketched out on paper the stuff that we really wanted to own, and the stuff that we're like, we can do this. This is in our skill sets, and stuff that we just didn't want to do, and kind of divvied stuff up accordingly. Fundraising and finances was always the trickiest part of that, because, and that actually for me was something that came down to why I thought that model, at least for Brian and I, with our interests and our skill sets, ultimately wasn't serving the business. Whereas like there were conversations around COGS, for example, right? Knowing where our runway was, knowing we needed to go out, we needed to change something. We needed to change our marketing strategy so CAC was lower. We needed to go back and reformulate the product so that COGS were lower and our margin was higher, or we needed to get more money in the door fast, right? And these are all financial decisions. And what I learned in the trenches with Brian is that we disagreed on what needed to happen there. And ultimately, that was not suitable for the business. Like, the business at that time needed a crisp decision in order to pivot and run fast in a direction, right? Whether it was reformulating the product, raising more money, or whatnot. And we weren't able to really see eye to eye on that. And so what that ended up doing was we kind of disagreed with the financial aspect because we were still sharing financial decision making. And where I have left, my thoughts now, candidly, is I do think a co-CEO model can work, but I believe that someone needs to own finances. At the end of the day, there needs to be one decision maker around that. And that's actually been a really difficult thing for me to come to terms with, because I do want to see various different leadership models that aren't hierarchical in nature. And so I think that's a really tricky thing to come around to. But in those early days, when a startup will live or die based off of the runway, I think you can't have, at the end of the day, like a wishy-washy decision and change your mind all the time. Like, the business itself needs from its leaders a crisp strategy to run with. And I noticed that we were not able, as co-CEOs, to give Parable that kind of leadership. And that's actually when I raised my hand and I was like, look, like, the co-CEO model is not serving Parable. Right. And I actually entered the conversation around, like, I think something needs to shift with co-CEO here, not as like, I want to stage a coup and take over the company. Right. But as like, my responsibility as one of the CEOs is to serve Parable. Right. And I knew that our arrangement was not serving the company. So that's how I actually came to the conversation about shifting that model. And throughout the course of those conversations, I had some really, really challenging, deep, reflective moments with myself, where I actually sat down and I visioned out, and I do this sometimes, but I'll sit down and kind of meditate for like 45 minutes on a route I could take in my life. And I try to just see what would happen. Like, I try to just follow it. And I did that 3 times with, okay, I stay in the company as CEO, Brian leaves, or Brian shifts his position. What happens? And I did it 3 times as well with, like, Brian is CEO and I shift, what happens? And what I couldn't help but notice there is that my life felt much more exciting and alive and healthy and exciting for me if I was not in the CEO position. And I will say, as a woman who, like, we are taught to, in the startup world, like, boss up, like, don't bend to the guys, like, stand our own, like, defend ourselves, lean in, to actually come to the decision that, like, I actually didn't want it, was so hard, because I knew what that would look like from the outside. And yet, like, my decision there was like, at the end of the day, I'm choosing 2 things. I want my life to feel amazing. I want it to feel alive and meaningful, and I want to be happy. And I want Parable to survive, and I want to increase the chances of its survival. And so the 2 of those mixed actually led to me saying, you know what, with a fair package for me leaving, I'm happy to step down. Like, Brian, step in, you got this, off to the races, give it your best shot. And that's what we did, and Brian took it for another quarter or so and ultimately decided to dissolve it because the fundraising situation was not working out well for it, and still had a lot of the same issues. And, to his credit, he did the best he could. And it, sometimes in startups, the models just don't work, and you got to just, like, cut your losses and move on to the next thing. So.
Wow, that's a really extraordinary story around visioning for yourself. What does your life look like in this scenario or that scenario, and feeling into it, and then making that decision. It's a very mature decision, and it's also very selfless insofar as you are making the decision based on what was best for the company. So part of your role as co-CEO is what is the right thing for the company? How am I acting in the interest of the company here? And then realizing, hey, maybe that means me not being around. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. But I'll say it's not, it's not just selfless, right? Like, I still owned a very large stake of the company. So I wasn't even necessarily thinking at that. It was multiple lines of thinking, but one of my lines of thinking was, I'm an investor in this company, right? Like, I own part of the cap table. How do I save my investment? How do I look out for my investment? Because that investment was sweat equity, right? I put in 2 years of sweat equity to get that investment. So that was me also protecting myself in a way, right? And I don't want to gloss over that, because I don't think that just presenting this as a selfless martyr model is the reality of it, right? I was doing my best to operate as, like, a savvy businesswoman, right?
Yeah.
And that was candidly the savviest decision for me.
Sounds like it was. It sounds like it was. And so, I mean, this is a really remarkable story of a company with potential, so many promising things, lots of moving parts, things that are very hard to execute. issues of timing and costs and resources and fundraising. My first question is, how does it feel to talk about all this live?
Yeah, I mean, it does, I'm definitely like in the growth edge that feels like the growth edge you're willing to go into, and not the one that you're still like, ooh, it's hard. But I think these are the conversations that I just want the ecosystem to be having, and I don't think any of that's going to change if we don't just talk about it. And, I've, again, like had the privilege of working with incredible people like Brian included. And, I want to tell the story of what happened so that other people don't feel like they have to hide it. So it's when we're hiding these stories that then we get this like kind of wacky culture that emerges. And I don't like that. Like as someone who's going to go out and create more businesses, like I do believe there are healthier ways to create businesses in the world. And like that's what I'm in service of. Right. And that journey continues for me, even though Parable is over. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so this next time around, it's like, how do I maintain my soul while I create businesses and the products and the services through them that help other people? Right. That's what it means to create a wellness venture. It's not just about the end product. It's also like, how do I maintain my own wellness in the process? So that's really the double investigation that I continue to be in. And conversations like these, help me actually refine the nuances of that challenge, because it's really challenging. We're creating something that hasn't existed before culturally.
The way that I always refer to this is I say, how do I grow the business without sacrificing myself? Because that's what we wind up doing. We sacrifice ourselves. And then guess what? If we don't have the resources, if we don't have the full tank of gas, so to speak, then we're not able to bring our vision to life. Super. Well, hey, Cristina, this is such a fantastic conversation. Thank you for being so open. Thank you for sharing these nitty-gritty details. This is stuff that a lot of people are going to benefit from having heard and learned from your experience, because so often in the press and social media and just general startups culture and conversation, we just see the story of up and to the right. We just hear the story of hustle culture and people crushing it and people faking it till they make it and all that sort of stuff. And what we're doing here is we're exposing, what does it really look like to run a company? Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. And by the way, you can have the same set of talented people and the same skill sets and all this sort of stuff. And again, that is not necessarily going to be the variable that drives success or not. So thank you so much for coming on the Conscious Entrepreneur podcast and being willing to share this tremendous amount of learning with us.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Alex. And I'll say to any listeners, if what I'm sharing resonates and you want to continue the conversation, please reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to just talk. And that, I think, is how we change the culture. So I would extend that invitation to any of your listeners, Alex.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Awesome.